presenters. Greg, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Mike. And again, welcome everyone to our program. It's my pleasure at this moment to introduce today's presenters. Some of them may be familiar to you from previous programs. Our first presenter today will be Cecilia Walls, who is my colleague in the accreditation program just down the hall. Cecilia, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And we'll be joined also by Elise Lecomte, who is calling in from Florida. Elise, thanks for joining us for, again, another program with us.
I'm glad to be here. Hello, everyone.
Thanks, Elise. And Charlotte Montgomery joining us from the Illinois State Museum. And Charlotte, this is, I think, your second webinar program with us. Am I right?
You are right, and I'm excited to be here today.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Charlotte. And last but not least, Katerina Spears, our newbie on the block, calling in from the Library of Virginia. Katerina, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for being here. So today's program is obviously on your institutional code of ethics, and this program is in the context of our new court documents verification program, which is going to be explained a little bit more clearly by my colleague Cecilia Walls. Cecilia, I'll leave it to you now.
Great, Greg. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. This webinar is one of a 5-part series that's related to the Core Documents Verification Program. And it's a new program in our Continuum of Excellence, which is symbolized by this graphic here. The Core Documents Verification Program helps museums keep documents up to date, and through the outside review of your documents provides accountability and confirmation through a second-party review of that your documents meet the standards and required elements of a core document. It helps distinguish your museum as a professional member of the field and an educational entity, and it streamlines your path towards accreditation. It's quick and it's easy. The 5 core documents that are verified through the Core Documents Verification Program are listed here. And after 40 years of reviewing museum documents in the accreditation program, the Alliance identified these documents as fundamental for basic professional museum operations because they embody core museum values and practices for every museum, regardless of size or type. And these documents codify and guide decisions and actions that promote institutional stability and viability, which, as you know, in turn allows the museum to fulfill its educational role, preserve treasures for future generations, and be an enduring part of its community. So there are required elements for each document, which we'll talk about a little bit later specifically for the Code of Ethics. And our purpose in developing the program was to confirm that an institution has an educational mission and the policy and procedures in place that reflect standard practices of professional museums. In today's program, we're going to discuss the required elements of a Code of Ethics, why a Code of Ethics is important, how to develop an institution-specific Code of Ethics, and we'll provide you with some resources on how to develop or revise your own Code of Ethics. So what we'd like you to get out of the webinar today is to determine whether or not your museum's Code of Ethics meet the standards and required elements, and to give you the resources to strengthen your own Code of Ethics. So let's get into the meat of the matter a little bit, and I'm going to hand over the call to Elise now to tell us what is a Code of Ethics.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. Museums in the United States are grounded in a philosophical tradition that underpins all nonprofits, and that is public service. Public service is paramount. Museums are organized as public trusts, holding their collections and information in trust for those that they are intended to serve, that is the public. Therefore, it is important that they be accountable to the public that they serve. The law provides a basic framework for museum operations, but legal standards are a minimum, and museums must do more than comply with local, state, federal laws, and international conventions. They must take steps to maintain their integrity in order to warrant public confidence. In other words, they need to act ethically as well as legally. A code of ethics set forth standards that a profession deems essential in order to uphold the integrity of a profession. An institutional code of ethics describes a series of values that demonstrate the museum's commitment to public accountability and ethical practices. It is intended to instill trust in the museum's actual practices. So ethical choices are rarely clear-cut options between right and wrong. They deal with the gray areas. So there's no one correct answer to most ethical problems. An ethical dilemma usually begins with an unclear interpretation of the problem to be decided. So a museum's code of ethics provides guidance to the museum professionals, for example, the governing body, the staff, and the volunteers. And it provides guidance about how the museum should operate ethically and how those museum professionals are to perform their duties in an ethical manner according to the values that underlie professionally agreed upon museum practice. The document addresses not only personal and professional conduct, but collections and truth in presentation. That is, the honest and objective representation of objects. It covers related ethics as well and should reference the museum's adherence to applicable laws. Now over to Charlotte.
Thank you, Elise. I think I want to ask a question before we go any further. How many of you have a code of ethics? I'll give everybody a chance to respond to the question.
Oh, that's interesting.
Wow.
Interesting.
That's very interesting.
And I'm wondering if we can ask folks in the general chat box off to the left for those of you who don't have one, maybe offer a reason why, and some of those of you who are in process, what that actually means, where you happen to be in that process. Does this surprise you at all, Cecilia, Charlotte, Elise?
It surprises me, only because, you know, when you're looking at AAM's best practices, code of ethics is right out there, and the code of ethics, you know, is such a driving force behind conflict of interest, which is a big hot button for the Internal Revenue Service. So I am surprised.
This is Elise. I'm actually not surprised because most of the map reviews I do and consulting jobs that I do with other museums and some of the accreditation reviews, I find that the museums actually don't have a code of ethics, or they've had to write one in preparation for an accreditation review visit where they didn't have one before. So no, I'm not surprised.
And I found that too, Elise. This is Cecilia. In reviewing accreditation documents for the Alliance, I have seen that quite frequently. The museums create the document just for the accreditation review. And I think it's really important for museums to know that this document is essential for professional practices in museums.
Well, and I see a couple of comments that have come in on the side. Some folks are just beginning the discussion and have done a lot of in-house conversation, but not one approved yet. One of our participants is just starting a museum. Actually, a couple of people are just starting new. And some people are brand new to their museum and have never engaged in this process yet.
So it's great to have you all here to learn about it.
If we have one, I've never seen it.
That's a
and
comment
it's good for
I
your
get.
staff to know.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a comment I get a lot as well, and I think we're going to talk about that a little later on.
Great.
Well, now, Kat, we're going to have you talk about why an institution-specific code of ethics.
Okay, and I was just going to say, when I used to do review for the accreditation program, we could usually tell when somebody was sending in a code of ethics they had developed just for the accreditation process because they usually just printed off a copy of the AAM Code of Ethics and submitted that with the museum name on the top. So it's always better to be doing it as a process that's thoughtful instead of doing it because somebody is telling you need to do it for accreditation. So we're talking about why an institution-specific Code of Ethics and why you shouldn't just take the AAM's Code of Ethics and adopt it as your own for your institution. And so I started with the idea, which was mentioned in the introduction, of public trust. And that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, especially if you go and get your master's degree in museum studies. They talk about public trust, but they don't really talk about what that means. And so I just wanted to start the conversation with that, talking that public trust, the idea is that the public is entrusting us as stewards, as museum professionals, with their cultural heritage and their cultural property, with the expectation that we will manage that cultural heritage, adhering to standards and best practices for our field. So community members, whether that's your donors, your members, the people who attend your programs, your advocates at the government level, those people are only going to engage with you if they feel like they have that relationship of public trust, that your institution is trustworthy. And so, therefore, your Code of Ethics for the individual museum is also helping to define the relationship that your museum has with its community. So whether that's your local community, the people who visit your museum, or your broader professional community of archaeologists or zookeepers or art historians, that concept of public trust works on many different levels. The Code of Ethics allows you to hold your staff members, your institution, the board of directors, your governing authority, accountable for their actions. It's a tool that you can use, and it's something that guides every decision that's made and provides that accountability. And something that's become popular to talk about these days, but it is an important concept, is transparency. So in the museum field in particular, not every issue is black and white. One thing that we used as an example when we had a similar session to this at the VAM conference earlier this year is this idea of one of the requirements for Code of Ethics for museums is that you talk about in your code what you do with the proceeds from sale of deaccessioned items in your collection. So if you deaccession items in your collection and they're sold, and what is the money then used for? It's only supposed to be used for either the acquisition of new collections or for direct care of collections. Well, as those of you who work in museums, of course, know, that can be a very ambiguous definition. So you can't protect collections unless you have a working HVAC system. So does that count? Can you do repairs to your HVAC system? Because that corresponds to direct care to your collections. Well, that's an issue that you'll define within your Code of Ethics. So, so if you're making that decision to say we're going to go ahead and we're going to use proceeds from sale of deaccessioned items to fix our HVAC system, and then somebody comes back later and questions whether you should have been doing that, if that was a best practice or if that meets the standards for the museum field, you can demonstrate that it was a thoughtful process, that thought process went into the development of your code. So issues like that makes transparency much easier and makes it easier for you to explain the decisions that you make, which takes us right into informed decision-making. If you've gone through the process of hashing out and determining what are going to be the ethical guidelines for your institution, then you can go back to your Code of Ethics when you have to make decisions such as that and determine if it meets the ethical standards that you've set for yourselves. We also, as museums, we do have certain laws that govern our activity. But it's not just about complying with laws, but we're setting ethical standards beyond the law. If you consider most of the laws evolved and came into being because of the evolving standards in museums and the evolving expectations of the public and our community. So we're not just complying with the laws because that's the bare minimum of what we have to do, but we're setting those ethical standards that lead to future laws that are in effect for our nation and for the international museum community. And lastly, and this one seems maybe the most obvious one, is that there's issues specific to a type of collection or mission. So if you're addressing especially collection issues in your code of ethics, you're not, as you know, I work for a state library and archive now, we're not really concerned with things like what's going to happen to human remains in our collection because it's not an issue for us. So to say that we would comply with a law like NAGPRA just doesn't really make any sense. Obviously we would if there was any reason why we would take in human remains, but it's not going to happen. So we're maintaining a focus on things that are specific to our type of museum or specific to our mission and our activity in the community.
Thanks, Kat. That's a great summary. We're now going to talk about the standards and required elements of a code of ethics. On the screen right now are the specific standards that apply to public trust and accountability. And I'm going to go through these very quickly, of which the Code of Ethics is part, and I'm going to say them in more plain language terms. So to start off with, just be good. No, really. Not only be legal, but be ethical. Number 2, show everyone how good and ethical you are. Don't wait for them to ask. So have your Code of Ethics written out, approved by the board, and ready to just hand someone and say, see, here, we are good and ethical. 3, do good for people and know which people. 4, to be on the safe side, be nice to everyone else too, especially if they live next door. 5, avoid cloning. 6, look something like the people you're doing good for. 7, and maybe a bit like your neighbors. 8, let other people help decide what games to play and what the rules are. 9, share your toys. So while we have this wonderful professional language in the standards, it's really a lot of common sense in there. And remember that these standards are field-wide standards. They are not sent down from the AAM from on high. They are simply aggregated by the Alliance. We disseminate them back to the field. So these are generally accepted levels that all museums can achieve. Specifically related to a code of ethics, though, are some required elements. And every institution is different. So your code of ethics should reflect that. There are several things that any code of ethics, regardless of size or type, should include, though. It should always specifically state that it applies to members of the governing authority, staff, and to volunteers. These are all people that should be held accountable for their actions in the museum. The code should also be consistent with the Alliance's Code of Ethics for Museums or other codes that are issued by national organizations appropriate to your museum's discipline. So if you're a history museum, you might look at the Association for State and Local History Standards, ethical standards. Or if you're an art museum, you might look at the Association of Art Museum Directors, ethical practices for professional practices for art museums. Your code should also be tailored to and developed specifically for your museum. It shouldn't be a restatement of or a statement of adoption of the Alliance's Code of Ethics for Museums. As Kat was just saying, you really need something that's going to be very specific to your institution and work with specific issues that you may be dealing with in your institution. And Your code should put forth the institution's basic ethical public trust responsibilities as a museum and nonprofit entity, and should not be solely about individual conduct. It should include a statement on the use of proceeds from deaccessioning, and that should be consistent with whatever other language you have in your collections management policy or elsewhere. It should also be a single document and not a compilation or list of references to other documents. And of course, it should be approved by your governing authority.
Cecilia, this is Elise. I think another important statement that the Code of Ethics should include that often gets overlooked is reference to personal behavior. For example, collecting behavior, what your museum personnel are allowed to collect, what they aren't allowed to collect, and how their personal behavior can influence the museum ethics.
Absolutely. It should include both the personal and the institution-specific. Those conflicts of interest issues should definitely be included in the code as well. Thanks, Elise.
And Cecilia, this is Greg. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but your first bullet on the previous slide, which you described the Code of Ethics applying to the governing authority, the staff, and volunteers, strikes me that a couple of our colleagues in the audience said they've never even heard of it or they've never seen it. So automatically there's a disconnect.
Absolutely. So it's often written by one staff member and then just put on a shelf somewhere, and it really should be a team effort. It should the board should know about it and approve it. The staff should know about it and sign a statement saying that they've read it, as should volunteers as well. Thanks, Greg. That was a great.
Thank you.
Addition. Now I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte, who's going to talk a little bit about some steps to writing a Code of Ethics. We might have lost Charlotte momentarily.
I am so sorry. And I had my mute button on. I was trying to be very polite. And so I was just running away with it, and I apologize to everyone. To write an institutional code of ethics, a museum must honestly consider the issues that it faces or is likely to face and determine what ethical principles are needed to guide its operations and protect the integrity of the institution. And clear policies mean that staff and governing authority have standard procedures to follow and reference, allowing them to be consistent and prevent misunderstanding. And we're going to go through some of those steps that a museum will use in drafting the Code of Ethics. And this is very important to create a team. Everyone brings a different set of life experiences. And I think that it's also important that it be cross-disciplinary because everybody's going to bring a different set of experiences. Somebody in fiscal is going to have a much different concept of ethics than somebody, say, in your art department. So the team needs to be multifunctional. It's also going to be a team that's going to look at values, and not every museum, as you've seen, not every museum has a code of ethics. Not every museum has established values for their institution. Many museums have those values that support their mission, and when you're writing the Code of Ethics, you want to use those values to inform it, and if you don't have it, consider what values you think are important to your museum. If they don't exist, you need to develop those. Those affected by the Code of Ethics can provide feedback about what they consider to be the museum's values, and afterward, core principles can be identified to influence how the Code of Ethics progresses. It may be prudent for museums to send the final set of values to key stakeholders and the governing authority before you move on to continuing to draft your Code of Ethics. You want buy-in from everybody. In drafting the code and in getting approval, the anatomy of an institutional Code of Ethics It will help the museum consider what its policy should cover. It's important to determine who will be responsible for dealing with conflicts of interest when they arise, and most often this tends to be the board of directors chair or a separate ethics committee, and explore how the code of ethics will be enforced. The team should be encouraged to think through what type of disciplinary action would result from a violation of the code and make it explicit in the document. Too many times people draft a document on what should or shouldn't take place, but they don't take it to the next step and think, what are the repercussions if the code's not followed? After considering issues that face the museum, the team should draft an outline of the proposed code and circulate it among the team and possibly the museum staff as a whole. Once feedback has been received, the final draft must go to the governing authority for approval. The museum may want to consider circulating it beyond itself to key stakeholders in the institution. You want to also revise other documents. I want to throw that out here too, because your code of ethics could impact other policies and procedures you have within your museum. So once you've looked at that code of ethics and you have that outline, it's really important that you take a look at your other policies and procedures and see how those might change in light of your new code of ethics. You have to be sure that you're going to train staff, the governing authority, and the volunteers. A code of ethics is only as effective if the ethical behavior is nurtured. Governing authority and staff should be encouraged to turn to the code for guidance on questions or concerns and educated on how it could be used to the public's best interest. Leadership should cultivate ethical behavior so that the staff and the governing authority can make good decisions even when faced with situations that aren't specifically covered in the code. And it's important to review this document frequently and revise it where necessary, because especially in today's fast-paced technology, things that would not have been considered 5 years ago are on the forefront now. So it's important not to put it on the shelf, but to frequently look at it and see how it needs to be revised. And now I will turn it back to Cecilia.
Actually, Charlotte, this is Greg. Before you move on, I want to remind everybody in the audience that throughout the program, here's an opportunity for you to comment or ask questions in the chat box over to the left-hand side of your screen. And in the spirit of kind of prompting that, Charlotte, a couple of questions come to mind. You talk about creating a team, but from my point of view, a team has to have a leader. So who's in charge here? Who's in charge of writing the code of ethics, generally?
Well, from my perspective, it's been the director of the museum who influences more than anybody. Or if they want to delegate that responsibility, it needs to be somebody that has a broad picture of the institution as a whole. Too oftentimes people get caught up in their silos, and they don't have that overarching concept of the institution. And I think the director is in the best position, or her designated, or his designated staff person to bring that forward.
Great, thank you. And then I also just wanted to comment that you talk about values, and it seems very clear to me that values are discrete from the mission of the organization. An institution may have a mission, vision, and values statement. Is that true at your institution?
That's very true. Our mission is, I'm with a state institution, and our mission is actually written in our state statutes. The values are separate and distinct from that. I think it's important when you're looking at the values of a museum. The mission might be to collect archaeology specimens, for example. But the value associated with that is to abide by the NAGPRA guidelines. And so those are two separate and distinct issues apart from each other.
Thanks. And then one last question, and then it looks like we've got a couple coming in from the audience. When you talk about training staff and getting staff buy-in, what does that mean? Is it communicating the end product? Is it getting stakeholder buy-in as you develop it? How does that shape out?
Well, I mean, at our institution, we have them read the Code of Ethics, and they actually have to sign off on it because it is so important for the individual to understand their responsibility in following that Code of Ethics, particularly, as I think it was Elise who said earlier, or maybe it was Kat, about personal collecting, which is a big component in a Code of Ethics for a museum because people usually, if they're in a discipline, they're in it because they love it. And especially we have people in our art department who are avid collectors of art. And they need to be very careful that it's not specifically to the discipline that they oversee. And in our policies, if they do collect something that we also collect, we have the first right to buy that at the price they purchased it for. So these are things that could be foreign to somebody that hasn't worked in a museum environment. It's really important for them to understand and know what those rules are going forward so they don't make a misstep.
And to this last point, our colleague Elda in San Antonio wants to know if you all have your volunteers and docents sign this Code of Ethics.
Our museum does. The Illinois State Museum absolutely has the volunteers and the docents as well as the governing authority sign off on the Code of Ethics.
This is Kat here jumping in, and I actually had a situation from my past working for a historic property where I was the manager, where having a volunteer sign off on a Code of Ethics during the hiring process prevented some major legal issues down the road, and it was not a policy that had been instituted until I started there, and we made it a regular part of the volunteer training and initiation, and this volunteer did behave in a grossly unethical manner, but we were able to distance ourselves from it by saying these are not the policies that we set forth, and this person was not acting on behalf of our historic site, and then the person was promptly fired, let go, because of the behavior. So it really does, even though it may only come up once in your entire career, it really can be worth it to have that as a policy.
This is Elise. We have a volunteer manual and an employee manual, and we have a checklist of the documents in those manuals. And so they have to go through and read all the different documents, and then we have a sign-off page that they've done this.
That's great, everybody. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move on a little bit now. We are going to talk about the Code of Ethics in your museum's operations, and we're going to talk about weaving the code into all areas of the museum, which touches on a little bit of what Charlotte was talking about in involving everyone in the team of writing the Code of Ethics. But also, you want to make sure that even those beyond that team that's writing the Code of Ethics is aware of what the museum holds as ethical behavior, from the board to the director to the staff and the volunteers. Everyone who is involved in the institution should know about the Code of Ethics, read the Code of Ethics, and be aware and be living the Code of Ethics in their work. And the Code of Ethics itself needs to touch on all of the different areas of the museum. It needs to touch on the governance of the museum and the collections and the programs. In addition to those other conflict of interest, personal issues, it needs to touch on these institutional issues as well. So who is involved in the process? Kat, I think you were going to talk a little bit about this.
Yes, here I am. So one of the things that I thought of for this that was important for a museum is to actually define who your stakeholders are as part of the process. Sometimes with museums that have a broad community, or even if you're the only cultural institution in a small town, sometimes you take on a lot of roles in the community that wouldn't be traditional for a museum in say, a larger urban area, or where you had many, many different cultural institutions available. So clearly your governing board, your director, your staff, and volunteers, those are all very obvious people who can be involved in the process and who can have input. But also your donors and members. And sometimes your board, volunteers, donors, and members are all the same people, again, especially when you're talking about a smaller museum. So, and I wouldn't overlook people like your community partners. So maybe you have another institution in your community that's not part of your institution, but who, or which has programs that function through your organization, or you partner together on major community events, and so I wouldn't overlook that as well. And I know, especially in smaller museums where your board is really involved in the day-to-day operations of your site. Again, that's a whole other webinar to talk about the role of members of your governing authority. But that's the reality of small museums, is that your board members are often the volunteers who are in your museum every single day, and so they do become de facto members of the staff. And it's important that this process not just be looked at as writing the code and getting the code right, and so that it complies with standards that's set forth by the Alliance or that's set forth by your profession, but this is an educational process as well. For a lot of the people involved in your museum, board members, volunteers, etc., this is going to be their first exposure to the whole concept of museum ethics. You know, we're talking about it as something that we live and breathe every day, but for a lot of these people, it's going to be their first exposure. So the process of developing the code can be an educational one, and so the more breadth that you can get and who you bring into the process and make them part of it, the benefit may be that they're getting the education that they need to have the buy-in later.
And Kat, to your point, our colleague Amanda in College Station says that she imagines there could be significant pushback from volunteers who don't want their collecting activities curtailed, for example.
Sure, and I think you see not just in that area, but in others as well. And I've come into small museums and taken over as a manager or administrator and be told, well, this is the way we've always done it. So I think that involving those people in the process, helping you to do the research, to learn more about museum ethics, to learn more about why those standards exist and how they've evolved over time, sometimes those who are most difficult to get in line and to get the buy-in, if you engage them in the process, you can help yourself to avoid some of that. You're always going to have people who don't see why that should be significant, why we should have to comply with those things. And I think that this attitude of the American Alliance of Museums is establishing these standards and then imposing them on other museums is one that it's a myth that needs to be dispelled. These are standards that are developed by our field, by we as professionals who work in the field of museums every day, and the Alliance just responds to those trends and the evolution of those ethics. So it's a very difficult concept to teach, but if you can involve those people in the process, you can make it. It is possible. I've seen people be converted.
Thanks very much, Kat.
And now Elise, I think, is going to talk about who the code should be shared with.
Thanks, Cecilia. Well, we've talked a lot about already how everyone in the museum, the governing members of the governing body, the volunteers, the staff, should all know about the Code of Ethics. And that's important because, as we've discussed, the ethical principles and guidance to ethical behavior is codified in the Museum Code of Ethics, and therefore it should be shared with everyone within the museum. As we've discussed as well, it can be circulated by including it in orientation packets or manuals. And it's also a good idea to remind museum personnel of the document's contents periodically, say in an annual retreat or a yearly meeting. So in terms of which members we should share it with, of course the governing authority, such as a board or a parent organization or whatever your governing structure is. They have the ultimate responsibility for seeing that the museum carries out its fiduciary duty to the public in a responsible and ethical manner. Therefore, it's the duty of the governing authority members to uphold and abide by the museum's code of ethics. It is also their duty to see that all museum personnel abide by the code, and it's usually the governing authority that officially approves and signs the code of ethics. The director is part of the museum's governing authority. That person is the museum's leader and the person with ultimate administrative and fiscal responsibility and authority. Therefore, the director should know the contents of and abide by the organization's code. That person is also responsible for making sure that all museum personnel abide by the code of ethics. In terms of the staff, they are the heart of the institution. They are responsible for the day-to-day operation of the museum, be that in collections, exhibits, education, or administration. In addition, they also serve as the interface between the museum and its public. So as museum professionals, they have certain ethical responsibilities to the museum professional in general, and of course to the public. Therefore, they too must be aware of the contents of the museum's code so that it can guide their work and their behavior, both professional and personal. It's also important for the volunteers to know about the code. Again, they are or can be the heart of the institution, depending on the structure of the institution. They can also be responsible for the day-to-day workings of the museum in whatever area of the museum they work. They often also serve as an interface between the museum and its public. Therefore, it's important for them to be aware of the code and let it guide their work and their behavior, again, both professional and personal. One set of people we don't talk about often is the visitors. As we have learned, the museum is accountable to the public, and visitors are a very important constituent of that public. So if the visitor knows that the museum has a code of ethics and are aware of how the museum and its staff are guided to act ethically, then they will be reassured that the museum is acting ethically, transparently, and is accepting its responsibility of accountability. On the other hand, if the visitors think that the museum is not acting ethically, then knowing about the code of ethics gives them something with which to confront the museum about its unethical behavior. And a good example of this was at the Brandeis University with the Rose Museum, where not only museum personnel but donors, the museum's public, the museum's visitors really rallied together and got the university was going to sell the collections for operating expenses. And they were able to get that turned around, the constituents of the museum. Because they knew about what should be ethical behavior and what shouldn't be. There are lots of other organizations or institutions or people that should know about the Code of Ethics. Some include representatives from the parent organization, if your museum has one. For example, the University of Florida is the parent organization for the Florida Museum of Natural History. So we share our documents with the provost, the president, and the U.S. Foundation, which is our development organization, among others. We also share it with representatives from the local, that is city and county, regional, and state government. Again, the Florida Museum of Natural History is a state institution, so we share our documents with our state representatives and our senators quite frequently. Your museum should share your code with any institutions with which you have loans or repository agreements. You can share it with fellow museums and other cultural institutions in general. For example, the Florida Museum of Natural History is centered on the Cultural Plaza with the Harn Museum of Art and the Center for Performing Arts. So again, we share our documents with each other. And you can also use them when you apply for grants. Share them with the granting agencies. to show that you are being accountable and transparent and doing what you're supposed to do ethically. A good place to publish your code is on your museum's website. And again, the Florida Museum of Natural History does have its Code of Ethics on its website. Now back to Charlotte.
Well, Elise, can we jump in for just a second?
Sure.
I had a question for you because I saw Melissa had a question about a museum as a part of an institution that has other aspects, like a theater. So would the code apply just to their museum department, or the museum, or the whole institution? And as a museum professional in an institution that's part of a larger organization, can you comment?
Yes, I think that the code needs to be specific to each particular department. So the museum would write its own, and the theater would write its own, but taking into account the institutional code. For example, if there is one. So the University of Florida has a code of ethics, and there may be parts of that that we have included or we relate part of our code to. When we were revising our code several years ago, we made sure that we know the contents of the university's code. Anything that the state legislature has put out, we have to know what that's all about and sometimes include parts of that in our code. And not necessarily verbatim, but we have to include statements that relate to the contents of these other codes.
And also, Elise, our colleague Abernathy wants to know if now where did that question just disappear to?
I saw it earlier, but I don't see it now. I think it was how wide is the net of stakeholders in a university-based museum?
Thank you, thank you.
Actually, it can be far-reaching depending on the structure of the university. I mentioned our development organization, which is the University of Florida Foundation. We have to include or at least share the code when we're drafting it and after it's written with the people in the development office. Again, there's ethical behavior that they have to follow, and it does relate to the museum in terms of development. We have to share it with the provost and the president. We don't share it with the dean because our director is a dean. Our museum is a college, considered a college. But if you had a dean over the museum, you'd want to share it with him or her. Stakeholders include the university students and the people in the public that use the university, not only its facilities but its services. So the stakeholders can be quite different than for other types of museums that, say, are overseen by city or county government. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. And if other colleagues in the audience have any thoughts, it seems like we have a few folks from university-based museums, so certainly feel free to offer your suggestions. I'd also like to take a moment to address Amanda's question, and she wants to know what are the ways to share the museum's code of ethics with visitors other than posting it on the museum's website?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are times when you can share it or refer to it in some of your public program, perhaps, or in exhibits. We often talk about conservation, wildlife conservation, cultural heritage conservation in our exhibits, and that's a place where you can talk about museum ethics and how your museum follows, what your ethical practices are. Right now, that's all I can think of, but I'm sure I'll come up with something else in the meantime.
We address it too when you're having our library. We get a lot of this is Kat. Sorry, we get a lot of in-kind gifts as a library. People donate massive amounts of personal papers and book collections, private libraries, and things. And so that you have to have that conversation with the donors, and this goes back to transparency, talking about, well, what's eventually going to happen to those materials, and how are they going to be used, and what happens if it's not something that we want to accession into our collection. So we you have to have very frank and open conversations about our ethical standards and why they exist. And there's a lot of, this goes back to your collections management policy as well, but that informs your code of ethics, to say that we have certain policies in place of what we keep, what we collect, what we don't. And so that's donors and members, you end up sharing those. It's important to do that. You shouldn't leave it off the table. Have the open conversation and talk about your ethical standards for your institution and why they exist. So that's another tool for communicating your code of ethics.
And Kat, since we have you on the line, maybe you can take a moment to respond to Jessica's question, in which she asks, besides deaccessioning and personal collecting, what are some other key issues we should address or be aware of when drafting the code?
I think that often the most overlooked areas is anything outside of collections. People become so focused on the ethics related to collections that they forget about other operational parts of the museum, certainly related to programming, truth in programming and exhibitions, but of course that kind of goes back to collections as well. But use of donated funds, the accounting practices of the institution, and one thing that I have seen a lot of is where retail operations are often ignored. There is a reason why there's an ethical standard for retail operations to have some sort of mission relationship to your institution. I mean, you're not just going to go out and open an Arby's or a gas station to provide funding for a museum. It should have some mission relationship to your museum. So all of those, I mean, think about the museum operations in the broader sense, not just collections and education when it comes to ethics.
This is Elise. I think that comment about the retail operations is great because a lot of times you may get asked to accept, or the museum administration may want you to accept a collection to turn around and sell it. We've had that happen a number of times, and we've had to pull out our documents for the development officer who was new to museums and didn't understand our practices. And we had to sit down and have a talk with him and explain why we did not want to accept these sculptures, which were totally outside of our mission, just to sell them, to get funds for operating expenses or whatever he was going to use them for. So that's very important. Also, because we have archaeological collections, we often have to work with the museum gift shop to make sure that they're not selling things that even replicas that might look real. We have to be very careful about that because we don't want to promote people buying archaeological objects.
That's great, Elise, and I think that kind of plays into what we're going to be speaking about next, or what Charlotte's going to be speaking about next, which is ethical behavior in museums.
You know, this is very broad. You cannot look at ethical behavior without looking at the examples out there of unethical behavior. And, you know, there are too often times when directors, staff get in a position where they feel that the ends justify the means. When it comes to securing objects for the collection, for example, you know, all you have to have is opportunity and the ability to rationalize why you want that collection for your museum. Many times it's, well, I knew our institution could take better care of it than the circumstances that it was in when we secured it. And that's not ethical. Even our institution, a donor provided us with an artifact. We had no reason to believe that it wasn't secured in an honest, forthright manner. 10 years down the road, it became clear that it had not been obtained in an ethical manner. And we did the right thing, and we gave it back to the true owners. It was actually a third world country. But you just have to be very careful when you're securing objects for the collection, the rightful ownership of it, and make sure that you're following those guidelines that are in your code of ethics. Staff really needs that kind of guidance. Otherwise, there is the rationalization when an opportunity presents itself to add to the museum's collection. You know, there's also fiduciary responsibilities that need to be considered. If we back up for a minute and look at the retail aspects of the museum, there was a museum director, and I'm not going to name any names here, but it actually ended up in a court of law, and the jail time was potential here because they rationalized that they should use funds to help underwrite the retail division with the mindset that, well, we're going to pay back the endowment. At some point, the museum's gift shop will be profitable. We'll pay back the endowment, and we've moved the institution forward. The public's none the wiser. Well, obviously that did not happen. But they justified their actions by saying they were doing it for the good of the institution. You know, I also want to touch on personal collections because this is a very hot button in museums. And it's once again, it's not just staff, it's volunteers and it's board members, and you know you could be competing with your museum on what you collect, and right now currently there's kind of a disconnect because staff members feel like they're not competing with the ability of their museum to acquire something for the collection if they're using a flea market, for example, to obtain it, or they're using eBay. And typically, let's say 10 years ago, a museum would not have been going through eBay listings to secure anything for the museum. I think that's changing over time, but there were several instances in our institution where people were saying, well, I'm not competing with the institution because the museum would never go on eBay and bid on this. So you have to be very careful, particularly when it comes to board members. That's a very tricky thing to handle. Much like one of our participants said that they imagined volunteers would push back because they wouldn't want their private collecting to be an issue for an institution that they volunteer for. Board members, it's even trickier because generally a board member is somebody that's a donor to your institution, and what is the right way to approach that with a board member when they've acquired something that is competing with your institution? You have to really have a lot of good human resource instincts to be able to have that dialogue with a board member.
Thanks, Charlotte. And now Kat is going to talk a little bit about periodic review and revision of the Code of Ethics.
Yeah, so when I had my, I guess, first position managing a museum, I'll just give this little anecdote talking about review and revision because there was this incredibly long mission statement that I couldn't find any evidence that the museum was actually doing anything that it stated in this mission statement. And so I finally kind of screwed up the courage to talk to the board about it and said, so, you know, this mission that you've been following apparently since 1962, can you tell me where you see the programming and exhibitions that fulfilling this mission? And they said, oh, you know, we never really liked that mission, but we just weren't sure how to change it. So that set us off to embark on the process of doing a mission, a review and revision, and coming out with a mission that actually reflected something of what we wanted to do as a museum and what we were capable of doing. And so sometimes museums get stuck in a rut where it's like we've had this mission for 40 years, and so we're not really sure what to do with it. And I think Code of Ethics sometimes run the risk of being the same way, that we've got one. Nobody's read it, and I couldn't tell you what it says, but we've got it in place, and so we just keep it on a shelf. It's important for these core documents of museums to be green documents, that they're always being under the process of review and revision. And especially with a Code of Ethics, new standards are always emerging in our field. We sometimes don't even realize something is an ethical situation until it shows up on the front page of the local newspaper as a conflict for us. And And so the fact that standards are emerging and have changed dramatically over the past 100 years means that you do need to go through that periodic review and revision. Make sure that you're up to date with current standards and best practices and laws in our field, because museums grow and change. Our collections expand, our funding changes, our missions change over time, especially as the museum relationship with our communities has changed over time. And as these new issues and laws emerge, our ethical guidelines, our code of ethics needs to reflect that. And all of these provide the opportunity, again, going back to this idea of it being an educational process for everyone involved. So you're always going to have, hopefully, new board members rotating on, and you're going to be acquiring new staff, new volunteers coming in, new visitors coming through the door. And so that education process needs to be ongoing, so that when you have whoever your current stakeholders are in place, if the Code of Ethics was developed 25 years ago, your current stakeholders are going to be all new staff, new board, new volunteers. How are they going to get that buy-in that you need if they were not part of the process? So the review and revision allows you to make that educational process current and ongoing for the people who are involved in your museum.
Great, Kat. Thanks so much. And now I think we have a quick question for the audience. What are some strategies that you've used in writing your own code of ethics that works for your organization? We have the question up on the screen now. You can enter it into the chat box there or into the chat box on the left.
Cecilia, this is Elise. While people are doing that, I'd just like to comment on the last slide and just say, it's been really important for museums to review codes of ethics within the last 15 to 20 years. We've all seen a lot of changes in the laws and international conventions and regulations related to things like collecting wildlife, collecting cultural heritage, NAGPRA, the Nazi-era provenance standards. So there's a lot going on, and it is so true that you need to review and adjust your documents, not just the Code of Ethics, but things like the collections management policy and other documents.
Absolutely, Elise. That is so true. And I think keeping up with those changing laws and regulations and standards in the field will help you decide when to review and revise your documents. I see Jessica from West Overton is currently reviewing their values in order to tailor the documents to their museum, which is great. What about from some of our presenters? How have you, what strategies have you used?
Well, I just responded back to Jessica's comment, but there's nothing wrong with going out and finding half a dozen institutions similar to yours that you respect and think operate very professionally, and borrowing documents that they helpfully post on their websites to use as a jumping off point and starting the process. I've been guilty of that more than one time, but if there's no use in reinventing the wheel, if you can borrow, if they've gone through the process and you can get that, it helps you to get started and see what the standards are. And make a plug here for the Alliance and the sample documents bank that is there for institutional members of AAM. It's a really wonderful resource and saves you the trouble of having to review and find out whether or not the documents you find online live up to the standards and best practices.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks for the plug for the Information Center. Yeah, we have a lot of sample documents, including codes of ethics, that museums at Tier 3 can request to to look through and get an idea of how they'd like to start on their own documents, or even just maybe to see what some of the changes have been in the last 10 years or so. If you haven't looked at your Code of Ethics in 10 years, it'd be a good place to start.
This is Elise. Based on our conversation just recently, I'd like to respond to Alyssa's question about where she can find guidelines for board members in regards to personal collecting in the Code of Ethics. And the AAM Information Center and the AAM's documents are a great place to start. Also, again, to talk with other institutions that are similar to yours, to look at other codes of ethics and see what they do in regards to their board.
All right. Well, we're going to move on and talk a little bit with our presenters about suggestions and challenges that they've had in their own institutions in writing or revising codes of ethics. And we're going to start with, let's start with Charlotte. Can you tell me what some of the issues that became the biggest stumbling block or took you the longest to work out when revising or writing your most recent Code of Ethics?
The biggest stumbling block for us was the board members and private collecting. Probably 3/4 of our board are collectors of those items that the Illinois State Museum also collects. That's what makes them vested stakeholders in our institution, is their keen awareness and drive for us telling the story of Illinois. The complicating factor is that there are times when they are competing for the things that we collect. And we've got to be very diligent then in making them aware of the Code of Ethics. And there are a lot of institutions that will put in their Code of Ethics that they cannot collect. We've not done that, primarily because I don't know that we would get the kind of support that we need out of a board of directors if they've got no vested interest in what we're doing. And so how we approached it was, we said that they could collect, but that if they did acquire something that we as well are collecting, that we have first right of refusal. So they tell us what it was they acquired, and then we've got the ability to say, oh, we want that for our collection, and we will pay you what you paid for it. Or we say, you know, we don't need it. It would be duplicating something we got, or it's taking the collection in a broader realm than we want to go. And I think that was one of the biggest stumbling blocks for us, and that was kind of our concession, as it were, to try to keep valuable board members and keep them happy and abide by a Code of Ethics as well.
Sounds like you came to a really good compromise there. So working together, you developed what works for your institution.
It's working so far.
That's great. That's great. So Elise, what would you do differently next time you revise?
I think that we would try to include a broader range of people in the development of the code. A lot more staff members from a lot of the different divisions, because the biggest pushback that we have is from the staff members who say, well, that's the way it always has been done. That's the way we've always acted. And, of course, we did hear that earlier in the presentation today. But we have to often deal with staff members who want to keep doing things the way they've always done it. So I think including a broader range of those staff members, not the administrative people only, you know, the collections people, and more volunteers as well. We have a large volunteer base, and including some of them would be better for us, I think.
That's a good idea. Kat, were there any unexpected challenges or benefits in the development of your most recent Code of Ethics process?
I think the biggest challenge was, for me, this was a smaller museum, 2 full-time staff and then a handful of part-time staff. And so I was in one of those situations where the board had a very vested interest in day-to-day operations and were frequently there. And often, just in the interest of trying to be helpful, they would, hurt or go against ethical standards. But there's you say, for example, you have a 85-year-old board member / volunteer who got something for Christmas and thinks, oh, well, I can't use it at home, but they could sell it at the museum and the shop, and I'm going to take it down there. And even though it is an ethical issue to sell something completely unrelated in the shop, you have to learn when to draw the line. And so for me, I guess board education was always the biggest challenge whenever I would step into a museum and trying to develop any kind of governing documents. And it really is, it's just like your board cultivation. It has to be ongoing, that educational process. And sometimes it's not a formal process, it's a very informal process. Learning to politely but firmly keep people apprised of the fact that you're maintaining an ethical standard based on your code, and there's just no exceptions to it, because then it makes it easier when the big issues do come down the pike to deal with those.
Yeah, that's great. I see a question in the parking lot about from Laura Hutton on if the AAM Code of Ethics general framework works for your museum, what are the guidelines for taking what's already been done and editing it to become your own? Any comments from our presenters on that?
I am, just because of my experience in, this is Kat, sorry, just because of my experience reviewing documents for the accreditation program, I would say that certainly be informed and have read, but it's too tempting to just use the code and change a little bit here and there from the AAM. It's really better if you can use other samples of codes to read, certainly, but it should be written from scratch for your institution. And that's just a personal opinion. That's not any kind of professional standard. Having seen it done enough times where people would take it and tweak a sentence here or two or just stick their institution name in where it was convenient, and I think that it defeats the purpose of the process, which is that going back to that education and getting the buy-in and making sure people really understand fundamentally why those standards for ethics exist.
Absolutely, Kat. This is Cecilia. I think the process of developing the code or revising the code, although if you're starting from scratch, you really do need to go through that process of garnering what your institutional values are and using that teamwork to develop that code of ethics. And the AAM Code of Ethics is a great place to start, just learning more about what some of the ethical standards are in the field. And but you really do need to go through that process as an institution. We're going to move on now and talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available for developing a code of ethics. Of course, there are the standards. We have the National Standards and Best Practices book, which is available from the AAM bookstore, and all of the standards and ethics are available on our website. If you're an Alliance Museum member, you receive a free copy of the Standards and Best Practices as a PDF, which is a really great resource. The new multi-program structure of the Continuum of Excellence also offers a great opportunity for various levels of assessment and feedback and recognition, in particular the Core Documents Verification Program. And we have some resources on our website that can really help you in developing your code. We have the reference guide on developing the code and also a code of ethics activity that you can use with your staff and board on developing a code of ethics, and it was developed through the Museum Assessment Program.
And Cecilia, this is Greg, just to remind everyone that these are just samples for this particular core document, but you have these kinds of resources available for all the core documents in the Core Doc Verification Program site.
Absolutely. We have 2 more webinars in the 5-document series. The next one is on September 11th, and it's about the education-focused mission statement, so your institutional mission statement. And then on November 6th, we will be talking about institutional planning. We also have various resources in the Alliance bookstore, museum ethics, codes of ethics and practices, and of course the Code of Ethics for Museums, which you can get in a nice little booklet from the bookstore that you could hand out to your board members. It's also available on one of our web pages, has the Code of Ethics for Museums as well. The Center for the Future of Museums has a blog that many of you may be familiar with, and they often speak about ethical issues and the future of ethics. I'm putting the URL down into the chat box now if you want to just copy that down. It's at the bottom of the slide as well for that if you'd like to read more. And of course there are other organizations out there that have resources and that have codes of ethics. The International Council of Museums Code of Ethics is available. The Association for State and Local History Statement of Professional Practices, Professional Standards and Ethics, and the Association of Art Museum Directors also has professional practices in art museums, which are really great resources to use if you're interested in learning more about different specific discipline ethics.
And Cecilia, this is Greg again. You mentioned it earlier, and Kat, I know you did as well, but this slide is a good reminder that when we're talking about standards and best practices for the field, and in this case, an institutional code of ethics, this is not AAM, AAM's version, or the AAM coming down with the mandate that this is how you should operate. But we work in collaboration with many other organizations to help promote standards and best practices for the field broadly, not just AAMs.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And now, Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about our membership structure?
Sure. I just want to spend a moment on this because I know many of you in the audience are here because of your institutional member benefits at one of the tiers of institutional membership. And so this is just a quick reminder or refresher for you if that's the case. And for those of you who may not know about our new membership structure that we launched this last fall, we've simplified our institutional membership structure with the top tier 3 being the full suite of benefits all the way down through tier 2 and tier 1. And so we really encourage you to take a look on our website under Join in the membership benefits category, because there are a lot of benefits, including access to programs just like this one that you're participating in today.
And also access to the Alliance Information Center, which, if you are a Tier 3 member, receives the highest level of benefits and includes those sample documents and customized research services that we were speaking about earlier. But even Tier 2 museums receive access to our online resources and individual members as well. So take a look at some of those benefits that you receive with your Alliance membership.
Great. Thanks very much, Cecilia. And I know we've got a couple of questions that came in a few moments ago, so we'd like to spend the remainder of our time together looking at those. And if you have any further questions, for those of you in the audience, please feel free to type them in now. We had a question earlier from Margaret who wants to know about board members and their promises to donate or will their collections to the museum. Is this ethical? And I'm going to open that up to anybody in our presenter group here today.
This is Charlotte. That frequently happens. And there's nothing unethical about a board member wanting to donate or will a collection to you. The dilemma comes in if it's not museum quality artifacts. And we found that to be the case in a few instances, and we've had to actually decline the donation. The collecting comes at a price. Space is not free, and you have to be very particular about what you add to your collection. This is a sticky wicket. Some of the others might be able to weigh in here, but there's nothing unethical about a board member wanting to donate or will you a collection. It just becomes a question of, do you really want it?
This is Elise, and I think one of the hardest things to do is tell a donor, be they a board member or somebody else, that you don't want a collection. And you can use your policies, such as the Code of Ethics or the Collections Management Policy, to help you explain to them why you do not want the collection in a polite manner, and hopefully a manner that they will accept. It's just one of the hardest jobs I have to do.
Excellent point, Elise.
Well, I want to take a couple of questions here that are somewhat related. One comes from Jessica, who wants to know, is it reasonable to post our governing documents on our website, and also collections policy, strategic plan, and what should we offer as part of transparency as opposed to airing dirty laundry, I guess?
This is Elise. I saw that question earlier and have a few ideas about it. I think that your institutional documents, none of them should not be able to be published on the website. They should all be part of your transparency and your accountability. I'm talking about the major institutional documents, such as your Code of Ethics, your Collections Management Policy, perhaps a fiscal policy, your strategic planning if you choose to do so. None of those documents should contain any confidential information or information that you don't want the public to see. And we're a state institution, and so all of our documents have to be available to the public. So I think it's just a good idea in general to be more open and to allow a broader audience to have accessibility to our institutional documents.
And Elise, since I have got you on the line, Carolyn wants to know that given other museum documents which may overlap with the content in the Code of Ethics, things like the Collections Management Policy, etc., do you have any suggestions for ensuring that all the documents stay consistent? In other words, what's a good strategy for ensuring that when language is changed in one document, then it's changed in another? And maybe that's a question for any of you on our presenter panel.
Right. I think in general, when you, and I can't remember, I think Cecilia or someone mentioned this, when you revise a document or start to create a new document, it's a good idea to read over all of your documents. First of all, to see if any of them need to be revised for other issues, as well as the issues you're going to put into the document that you're developing. And if you're not doing any of that work, it's a good idea to review all your documents fairly regularly, say once a year or once every couple of years, to make sure that they're consistent. You know, build a small team, people that are good at editing, that know the institution very well, know all of the institution, not just, as Kat or Charlotte said, not just their silo. But it doesn't have to be a huge team. It gets unworkable when you're trying to revise or edit your documents and make sure they're consistent. So that's how we do it.
Elise, I concur with what you just said. When you are revising one document, look at all of the others just to make sure that they're consistent.
Yes, and Kat here to add that it might be helpful to have a board committee or an ad hoc committee on the board and give them the homework of doing that review when you go through a review process for a document, regardless whether it's institutional plan or collections management policy, that it's their job to then go and review the other documents as part of that process, not to go to do an in-depth revision, but just to look at them and see if that consistency is in place.
Great, thank you. And let's take one more question from Meg, who wants to know if they're a non-collecting institution, is the Code of Ethics where we would state that, and why? Or would we state we are a presenting organization only and address what we do?
This is Cecilia. I think for a non-collecting institution, stating that you are a non-collecting institution and outlining what you exhibit or what you present to the public is a good idea. I think both of what you have asked is a good idea to include in your Code of Ethics, because there will be ethical issues surrounding how maybe you borrow collections or objects to display, so you would want to outline how you do that. Or if you are just a hands-on institution, like a science center or a children's museum that does not have objects, then you can outline what you do for those situations as well.
Great, thank you.
I want to say, this is Charlotte, a Code of Ethics goes beyond just collecting issues. For example, when we revamped ours, we had never addressed fundraising issues and sponsorship monies that are received. And AAM, which has been a fabulous resource in reviewing our document compared to best practices, those were two key elements that was in AAM's documents that we saw that our Code of Ethics was lacking. And so we updated it accordingly. So even if you're not a collecting institution, there are still other elements that need to be addressed.
Great. Thanks very much, Charlotte. I just want to remind everyone that our presenters have come today from a variety of institutions, and I'm sure they would be happy to hear from you. Their emails are on the screen in front of you. Also on the screen in the upper left corner, you'll see that I've pasted an evaluation button. If you would, let us know your thoughts about this particular program by clicking on that yellow button, and that will give us important feedback. We do this for all of our programs, and it helps us keep on our toes for our program planning. And speaking of programs, a couple of you have asked about access to past programs, previous programs. These core document programs will ultimately be a part of our recorded library of archived webinars. We're just in the process of revamping our database and our content management system. So those webinars aren't up yet, but we're hoping to have those up in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye on those. And as Cecilia mentioned, we have two programs coming up on September 11th and November 6th. And those programs will shortly appear on the website under resources and online learning. So you'll be able to register for those in a few weeks. They just don't appear there yet. With that, I would like to take a moment to thank all of you, Cecilia and Elise, Charlotte, and Katerina, for giving up your time and your expertise and your thoughtful responses today. And of course, I want to thank our colleagues at Learning Times, and in particular Mike, who stepped in today to support this program, but Learning Times generally supporting all of our online learning efforts. And of course, thanks to all of you in the audience for being a part of this program today and for engaging. You will be, for those of you who are registered, you will be getting a follow-up email from us shortly with a recording link and also the pasted PDF handouts and a reminder about the evaluation if you would take a moment to do so. With that said, I think it's time for us to sign off. On behalf of Learning Times and the American Alliance of Museums, this is Greg Stevens. I hope you all have a terrific day.